Hi friends, welcome to the first episode of our big series on World War II, the deadliest, most devastating, and most horrifying conflict in human history. A war that, according to modern estimates, claimed between 65 and 80 million lives worldwide, soldiers and civilians alike. Not every country took part in it, of course, but if you look at the map, battles were fought everywhere. In Europe, Africa, the Pacific, and across Asia. While preparing this series, we dug through archives, memoirs, diaries, and, most importantly, newspapers from that era. Because old newspaper stories often hold the most fascinating details. Throughout this series, we'll cover every major theater of war. The Eastern Front, the Western Front, and the Pacific and African campaigns. Year by year, month by month. Before we start, a quick note. YouTube has changed its rules again, so your likes and comments aren't just a formality anymore. They actually help the channel a lot. Drop a comment, even if you disagree. Any feedback means the world to us. It's widely believed that World War II began at 4:26 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, when the first Luftwaffe aircraft, a Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber piloted by Bruno Dilly, carried out the war's first bombing run on the Polish town of Wielun. But that's not entirely true. In fact, the real start of the war began with a coded phrase, "Grandmother has died." To understand, we need to look briefly at what led to the Second World War. In many ways, it began for the same reasons as the First. Before World War I, Germany felt isolated, deprived of markets, colonies, and global influence. The war that followed was an attempt to change that balance, and Germany lost it disastrously. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations. Even those who drafted it admitted that an entire generation of Germans couldn't possibly pay it off, no matter how hard they worked. Germany was stripped of its colonies. Its army and navy were severely restricted, and a demilitarized zone was created along the Rhine River. After World War I, several great empires collapsed, the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, and soon after, the Ottoman Empire as well. New nations emerged. The Baltic states, Finland, and Poland gained independence. Hungary broke away from Austria, and fresh states appeared in the Balkans. In short, Europe's political map was redrawn completely. But the Germans never accepted this new order. The Treaty of Versailles was seen as a national humiliation, morally, politically, economically, and militarily. Germany wanted revenge. And when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he tapped directly into those emotions. He began rebuilding the army, reclaiming lost territories, and openly seeking dominance in Western Europe. That's the true root of World War II. Naturally, Hitler's ambitions faced resistance from France and Britain, the main powers of the Old World, and, of course, from the Soviet Union. But the relationships here weren't as simple as allies versus Hitler. There's a big question. Why didn't the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the US unite early on to stop him, after the Anschluss of Austria, or the Munich Agreement, or even the occupation of Czechoslovakia? The answer is simple. There were no real allies yet. Britain and France viewed Stalin's communist regime as an equal threat to European stability. They even went so far as to discuss possible military action against the USSR. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union wasn't sitting idle. After signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23, 1939, it began reclaiming former imperial territories under the slogan of historical restoration. The United States, for its part, wanted nothing to do with Europe's wars. Washington's attention was fixed on the Pacific, where tensions with Japan were already mounting. So by mid-1939, there were essentially no alliances. Britain and France were loosely aligned, but even they had betrayed Czechoslovakia at Munich. Still, both had promised to defend Poland if it was attacked. Poland's situation before the war was complicated. It had actually cooperated with Germany earlier. During the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Poland seized the Teschen region and felt confident about its position. The core territorial dispute that finally ignited the war was the Polish corridor. If you look at the map, East Prussia and mainland Germany was separated by this strip of land, which also included the Free City of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, governed under the League of Nations. This division caused endless friction over transit rights, custom duties, and the status of ethnic Germans living there. Eventually, Berlin proposed a deal to Warsaw. Give us the corridor so we can reunite Germany, and in return, we'll help you expand eastward into Soviet Ukraine. You've long dreamed of a greater Poland from sea to sea, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and this could make it real. Negotiations dragged on throughout 1939. The Poles refused. They were open to fighting the Soviets, but unwilling to give up the corridor. As tensions rose, Hitler realized that war was inevitable. All he needed was a pretext. German propaganda began spreading claims of Polish border violations and attacks on ethnic Germans, while Poland insisted on its innocence, knowing full well it couldn't possibly win a war against Germany. And so, the Nazis decided to create their own excuse. Through a secret operation codenamed Operation Himmler. Under the plan, the Nazis needed a series of Polish provocations, staged attacks convincing enough to justify war. The idea was simple. Create photographic evidence, show civilian casualties, and tell the world, look, the Poles attacked us. We have no choice but to defend ourselves. That's how Operation Himmler, or as one of its components was called, Operation Canned Goods, was born. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, devised the scheme. The plan centered on a small German border town, Gliwice, now Gliwice, Poland. The fake story would be that Polish saboteurs had seized a local radio station. To pull it off, SS officers were dressed in Polish uniforms and sent to capture the station. They fired shots inside the building and broadcast a short message in Polish, claiming that the Great Poland is striking back against German oppression. To make it sound authentic, they used Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans born in Poland who spoke fluent Polish, to deliver the message over the air. The only problem was victims. They didn't want to risk their own men being killed, so they came up with the canned goods idea, using a concentration camp prisoner already sentenced to death. They chose Franciszek Honiak, a Polish nationalist. He was drugged, shot, dressed in a Polish uniform, and left on site to simulate a firefight. When the fake battle ended, the Germans had their bodies, their evidence, and their photographs. The propaganda machine roared to life. "Polish aggression!" screamed the headlines. And that's where the phrase, "grandmother has died," came in. The man in charge of the operation, Alfred Naujax, one of Heydrich's subordinates, was waiting in a hotel room for the go-ahead signal. The coded phrase, "grandmother has died." On August 31st, 1939, he got the call. The operation began immediately. The staged firefight, the fake broadcast, the planted corpse. Soon after, Hitler addressed the German public, presenting himself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of German soil. He didn't call it a war. He called it a campaign to secure Germany's borders. Hitler's plan was to crush Poland quickly, believing Britain and France wouldn't intervene. just as they hadn't defended Czechoslovakia. For Hitler, Poland wasn't just a strategic buffer. It was the key to Lebensraum, or living space. It offered land, industry, and agriculture, the resources Germany needed to grow and dominate Europe. Once Poland was subdued, France would be next, and Britain could be forced into isolation on its island. As for the Soviet Union, there was no threat from the east. Germany had just signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, ensuring temporary peace. But their military cooperation actually went back much further, to the Rapallo Treaty of 1922, which restored diplomatic ties and allowed Germany to secretly rebuild its forces on Soviet soil. In exchange for technology and industrial know-how, the USSR provided training grounds, grain, oil, and raw materials. It was a mutually beneficial partnership. Stalin understood that a war with Hitler was inevitable. The pact was a way to buy time. And it worked, delaying the conflict for nearly 2 years, giving the Red Army time for partial reforms and mobilization, though, as history later proved, not enough. Before signing the pact, Stalin had tried another path. In the spring and summer of 1939, the USSR held talks with Britain and France about forming a joint military alliance. But the Western powers distrusted Stalin and moved slowly. Their reluctance pushed him toward Germany. Hitler, meanwhile, was eager to secure his eastern flank. He ordered Ribbentrop to agree to all Soviet terms, as the deal guaranteed Germany wouldn't face a two-front war. With that, Hitler's hands were free. And so, on September 1st, 1939, German troops crossed into Poland. At 4:45 a.m., the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had arrived a week earlier on a so-called friendly visit to the free city of Danzig, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The first shots of the war. Moments later, Luftwaffe pilot Frank Neubert shot down the first Polish fighter plane. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. On the day of the invasion, September 1st, 1939, the Soviet Union quietly lowered its draft age from 21 to 19, effectively beginning a covert mobilization and moving troops toward the Polish border. And while I said earlier that the war couldn't be stopped, there was at least one last attempt. On September 2nd, Mussolini, the leader of Italy, proposed a peace conference involving Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Italy's political weight in Europe was already minimal, but Britain and France agreed to the idea on one condition. Germany had to withdraw its troops from both Poland and Czechoslovakia and halt all military operations. Naturally, Hitler refused. The next day, September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Following their lead, the British dominions, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, also entered the war, with Canada joining on September 10th. Meanwhile, in Spain, Francisco Franco took a surprising position. Despite being one of the most controversial figures in Spanish history, the man who plunged Spain into civil war, crushed Catalan and Basque autonomy, and ruled through repression. Spaniards still credit him for one thing: somehow keeping Spain out of World War II. Spain was among the first European nations to declare neutrality. Franco announced that Spain would side with no one. Its ports and banks would remain open, and it would trade with all. By September 6th, the Polish government had been evacuated from Warsaw to Lublin, and the country's gold reserves soon followed, transported south toward the Romanian border. 2 German armies, Kluge's 4th and Kuchler's 3rd, had encircled a major Polish force, forcing mass surrenders. On the same day, the Germans captured Krakow. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, China was locked in a brutal war with Japan. Japan had launched a full-scale invasion, and the fighting had turned into a horrific bloodbath. Western powers, the US, Britain, and France, tried to mediate, but Japan insisted on installing a puppet government to secure its economic interests. The fighting was relentless, and Japanese forces were also clashing with Soviet troops along the Mongolian border. By early September, Japanese forces were still battling near Khalkhin Gol, a conflict entering its final phase. On September 5th, 2 Japanese battalions tried to seize a strategic hill and lost more than 350 men. Proof that Japan was still fighting the USSR even as Europe burned. Back in Europe, Germany tightened internal control. A new censorship and security law introduced the death penalty for acts of sabotage, espionage, or anything that could undermine the defense of the nation. You might ask, where were the French and British armies while Poland was being torn apart? By September 6th, the answer was nowhere near the fight. The French were doing what history would later call the Phony War. Fulfilling their formal obligations to Poland, the French army crossed into the Rhine Valley and captured a dozen small German villages. It looked, at first, like the beginning of a real second front, a strike into Germany's rear that could change everything. Maybe the British would soon join in, and Germany would face the nightmare of fighting on 2 fronts again. But nothing of the sort happened. The French stopped almost immediately. Ahead of them stood the Siegfried Line, Germany's fortified belt built after World War I. It mirrored France's own Maginot Line, a massive defensive network of underground bunkers, artillery positions, and barracks designed for long, static warfare. This was the popular military doctrine of the time: dig in, hold the line, and wait. Europe was full of such fortifications. The Finns had the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus, guarding against the Soviets. The Belgians had their Albert Canal defenses to block a German advance. The idea was the same everywhere: prepare for a slow, positional war like the last one. And that was exactly the problem. France was ready to fight the previous war, not the next one. Its generals believed in a long, immobile conflict of trenches and strongpoints, while the Germans were preparing something entirely new. Fast, mobile, mechanized warfare built on tanks and surprise. So after taking those 12 villages, the French stopped and stayed put. For an entire year, almost nothing happened. There were occasional artillery duels, a few bombing raids over the Ruhr, and constant patrols, but no real fighting. Inside France, a strange cult of aggressive defense took hold. We're sitting on German soil, therefore we've already won. It was absurd, but that absurdity defined the early months of World War II. The world's strongest army was waiting behind its walls, while Poland was being erased from the map. At that moment, something important was happening in Moscow. A meeting between Soviet Foreign Commissar Molotov and the German ambassador von der Schulenburg. Molotov explained that, under the terms of the pact, the Soviet Union intended to protect the interests of the working and peasant peoples of Belarus and Western Ukraine, and even reunite Western Ukraine with its eastern brothers. Our troops, he said, are ready to enter Poland. Please inform us when Warsaw falls. Schulenburg replied that it would take a few more days. These Molotov-Schulenburg meetings happened almost twice a week during the campaign. The Germans and Soviets discussed everything: logistics, borders, timing. For Hitler, they were crucial. He wanted to keep his hand on Stalin's pulse, to see exactly how the Soviet leader would behave. By September 15th, German forces had reached a line stretching from Bialystok through Brest-Litovsk toward Lwów, surrounded the city, and tightened the noose around Warsaw. A 12-hour ultimatum was issued: surrender or evacuate civilians. The Poles refused. On the 16th, Army Group North and Army Group South linked up, encircling two Polish armies. Essentially, Poland's last organized fighting force. The government begged Romania for transit to France, and the Romanians agreed. The Germans began their final assault on Warsaw. The Poles pleaded to evacuate civilians, but the Germans refused, reminding them that they'd already had 12 hours to do so. At 6 in the morning on September 17th, the Red Army crossed the Polish border. 20 minutes later, Molotov spoke on the radio. The Polish state, he said, had collapsed under its own weight, and the Soviet Union had no choice but to protect its Ukrainian and Belarusian brothers from capitalist oppression. The Red Army marched in under that slogan: liberation. That same day, the USSR signed a ceasefire with Japan, ending the fighting at Khalkhin-Gol, a clear signal that Tokyo would not open a new front against the Soviets. On September 18th, Soviet troops entered Wilno, now Vilnius, then a Polish city. German and Soviet troops met near Brest-Litovsk, and on the 19th another Polish army was surrounded and surrendered near Sura. 170,000 soldiers taken prisoner. At sea, German submarine U-29 sank the British carrier HMS Courageous. What did Britain do in response? Did they bomb Berlin? Maybe Hamburg? Or at least Kiel? Perhaps the island of Sylt near Denmark, where German coastal batteries stood? Not even that. The British were busy with something far more serious. They dropped 1 million leaflets over Germany. They had done it before. In the First World War, British propaganda was legendary. And now they tried it again. While our armies sit in their trenches, we'll destroy the enemy's morale. But of course, nothing came of it. Germany was euphoric. The people were celebrating victory, not questioning it. Inside Germany, however, rationing began. Bread, meat, butter, everything now required coupons. The French, meanwhile, were still sitting quietly on the Rhine. They had dug in and were doing absolutely nothing. In Moscow, Defense Commissar Voroshilov met with the German military attaché to coordinate the timetable for German withdrawal from western Ukraine and Belarus and the entry of Soviet forces. On September 21st, a small uprising broke out in Warsaw. The remnants of the police, soldiers, and civilians took up arms, but it was crushed almost instantly. Berlin and Moscow began negotiating the new demarcation line, effectively the border between two countries. What was the Western press writing at the time? I won't quote Soviet newspapers. They could easily be accused of propaganda, and to be fair, so could the German, British, and French press. Instead, let's look at a neutral source, the Daily Worker, an American paper, which reported that the Red Army's entry into western Ukraine and western Belarus was met with enthusiasm by the local population. The paper even published photographs showing crowds welcoming Soviet troops. That's how it looked through American eyes. And on September 22nd, in Brest, German General Guderian and Soviet General Krivoshein held a joint parade. Columns of tanks and infantry marching. The end of Poland. The next day, the German High Command officially declared the Polish campaign completed. Hitler, who had appeared in uniform on the very first day of the war, now wore it constantly, emphasizing his image as the humble frontline soldier who knew war, unlike those old Prussian aristocrats. German propaganda seized on that image, and it stuck. On September 24th, British troops finally began landing in France after weeks of endless debate in Parliament over how many to send and where. By the time they arrived, Poland no longer existed. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin turned to the next move. Soviet game moved into a new phase. On September 24th, Molotov received an Estonian delegation in Moscow. Officially, the talks were about trade. According to the Estonians, that discussion lasted about 15 minutes. Then Molotov got to the real point. "Trade is fine," he said, "but let's talk about bases," proposing to station a limited contingent of 10 to 15,000 troops there to prevent those territories from being used as launch points against the USSR. On September 25th, the Germans began their massive bombing of Warsaw, a brutal, indiscriminate attack with no real military purpose other than terrorizing the population and crushing the uprisings inside the city. That same day, Hitler signed a revealing document, an order preparing for a possible invasion and occupation of Lithuania, despite the fact that under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Lithuania was designated as part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Estonian delegation quickly finalized an agreement with Molotov, a trade treaty coupled with permission for the USSR to establish a military base in Estonia and station a limited contingent of 25,000 troops there. On September 26th, German forces launched a full assault on Warsaw. While in Moscow, Ribbentrop arrived for new talks with Stalin and Molotov, this time not about the demarcation line, but about a formal treaty defining a joint border between Germany and the Soviet Union. Back in France, the government officially banned the Communist Party, underscoring just how seriously the French viewed the threat of communism. Leftist and socialist ideas were wildly popular across Europe after World War I. Internationalist movements, women's organizations, calls for equality and social justice all spread through capitalist societies, captivating intellectuals and elites who carried those ideas into the masses. France's crackdown was, in that sense, completely in line with the broader policy of Western governments wary of revolutionary ideology. By September 28th, Warsaw had fallen. German troops entered the city, and talk of an independent Polish state would not resurface until 1945. That same day, Stalin received and ratified the treaty with Estonia. As he signed the papers, he reportedly told the Estonian delegation, "You did the right thing, very far-sighted. Otherwise your fate might have been the same as Poland's." By the end of September, Hitler had achieved his main objectives. He had avoided a two-front war, crushed Poland in under 5 weeks, and by early October, German divisions freed from the campaign were moving west. American journalists from United Press arrived to cover the situation, and, seeing the eerie calm along the front, coined the term the Phony War. They described an absurd scene. On the French side, wine, women, laughter, soldiers playing cards in their trenches. Across the field, German trains calmly rolling by, unbombed, unbothered, unopposed. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Germany and the Soviet Union finalized their Treaty of Friendship and Border, formally establishing the new line dividing Poland. In France, General Sikorski's government in exile was formed after the evacuation from Poland, the first of many shadow governments that would later gather in London as Europe fell one country after another. The French government, already on edge, banned the Communist Party and went further, confiscating all of its property. Britain protested, accusing Paris of violating freedom of expression and political choice. The French shrugged it off. For them, fighting communism seemed just as important as fighting Hitler. Across the world, Japan began bombing the Chinese city of Chengdu, launching a brutal new phase of the war in Sichuan. By October 10th, most German forces were redeployed to the Western Front. The French, seeing this, retreated behind the Maginot Line, that great fortress wall they believed impenetrable. They laughed at the idea that the Germans could ever break through. They felt perfectly safe. Behind those concrete walls, France fell asleep. In Warsaw, however, the nightmare was only beginning. SS death squads entered the city, rounding up intellectuals, officials, and priests. The arrests were massive, executions immediate. At the same time, a secret organization was born, the Service for Poland's Victory, the first underground resistance movement that would fight the Nazis from the very first days of occupation to the war's end. In the United States, the New York Times published a sharp editorial about the Soviet-Estonian Treaty. The Baltic, the paper wrote, is gradually falling under Stalin's control. And while Stalin surrounded his empire with security zones in the Baltics, and soon in Finland, the United States was doing something similar across the ocean. In Panama City, Washington and 20 Latin American states signed the Panama Declaration, creating a vast maritime safety zone stretching from 300 to 1,000 kilometers off the American coast. Officially, it was for hemispheric defense. In practice, it was the US drawing a line in the ocean, claiming the Western Hemisphere as its own sphere of influence. On October 5th, Hitler staged a grand military parade in Warsaw. Before cheering crowds and foreign correspondents, he declared that the Polish menace has been crushed and that the Reich's borders were secure. Poland, he announced, would be reorganized as the general government, a colony of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Molotov met with the Lithuanian delegation and offered them the same deal given to Estonia: a trade agreement, a Soviet base, and the right to station 25,000 troops. The same offer was sent to Finland, but in the Kremlin, no one really believed the Finns would agree. Here's an interesting turn. To be honest, I hadn't looked deeply into the Finnish question before, but it's worth noting this. After the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the empire, Finland gained independence. In 1918, the First Karelian War broke out. Finnish forces fought against units of the Red Army. It was during that war that Mannerheim made his famous sword oath, vowing to drive every Leninist thug, thief, and murderer from Finnish soil. Among Finland's ultranationalists, the idea of a Greater Finland began to take shape, one that would include Karelia and parts of Ingria. It might sound odd today, but back then such visions, Greater Finland, Greater Poland from sea to sea, were taken seriously. National governments genuinely considered expansion as a political and military goal. In those years, Finland was fiercely anti-Soviet. And although, after World War II, relations between the two nations would become relatively warm, before the war it was the opposite. Finland's government and political elite took a hard, openly hostile stance toward the USSR. On October 6th, Hitler quietly sent a message through diplomatic channels to London and Paris, proposing peace talks. He said, "The Polish question is settled. There's nothing left to fight over. Why not discuss peace?" France and Britain rejected the offer outright. Meanwhile, Japan launched a new offensive in China. To grasp the scale, 90,000 Japanese troops clashed with 180,000 Chinese. A brutal and bloody confrontation. After London and Paris turned him down, Hitler publicly declared that lasting peace had been established in Eastern Europe, and that the interests of Germany and the Soviet Union were now fully aligned. The Soviet newspaper Pravda reprinted his statement. For another day, Berlin waited for an answer from the British, hoping they might change their minds. None came. On October 8th, Hitler signed the decree officially dissolving Poland. The country ceased to exist, replaced by the so-called general government, Its first head was Hans Frank, a vicious Nazi butcher, one of the architects of the Jewish ghettos, a man who drowned Poland in blood. Around the same time, Germany learned that the Soviet Union was holding talks with Turkey, a southern neighbor under Anglo-French influence. The discussions hinted at a possible alliance, and Berlin began to suspect that the Soviets might be plotting to expand their influence toward the south. Ambassador Schulenburg rushed to see Molotov in Moscow to clarify the matter. Soon after, the Soviet Foreign Ministry released a statement. "We don't understand the nervousness of our German partners. We have every right to negotiate with Turkey. It is not directed against Germany." Even so, a dispatch went back to Berlin, noting that the USSR was stepping up its diplomacy, already stationing troops in Estonia, and soon to do the same in Latvia, Lithuania, and perhaps even seeking influence in Turkey. On October 9th, Hitler took his next step. He signed Directive Gelb, the plan for an invasion of France and the destruction of the Franco-British armies. Planning for the Western Offensive began. The following day, October 10th, marked another dark milestone: the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Lublin. Jews from across occupied Poland, and soon from Pomerania, Silesia, and Austria, were rounded up and forced into it. Meanwhile, in Moscow, negotiations continued between Soviet and Lithuanian representatives. The Soviets wanted a base in Lithuania and offered the Lithuanians the city of Vilnius, in return. They agreed. The city, formerly Polish, would now become Lithuania's capital under the new treaty, which also included the stationing of a limited Soviet contingent. Then, on October 11th, something happened that would shape the future of the entire world. A group of scientists led by Albert Einstein sent a letter warning that Germany was working to develop an atomic bomb. The reaction at first was muted. Few grasped what such a weapon could mean, but the Americans began to take the idea seriously. Stalin was informed, and his response was simple. The Soviet Union must have its own atomic project too. In Germany, meanwhile, the program was already gathering momentum, though, thankfully, they would never manage to build a bomb. As I mentioned earlier, Poland had now been converted into the general government. Deportations of Jews expanded, now including territories in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Pomerania. Mass relocations had begun. Jews were herded into ghettos that were, in practice, concentration camps. At the same time, negotiations between the Soviet Union and Finland were underway. The talks centered on Leningrad. Stalin was deeply concerned that the city was within easy reach of potential enemies. He demanded the border be moved 40 miles westward, and also requested the Hanko Peninsula and all the outer islands in the Gulf of Finland, key points controlling the sea approach to the city. In exchange, the Soviets offered Finland a larger but strategically insignificant tract of land in Karelia. The Finns refused. The negotiations dragged on, but it was clear that neither side would yield. Then, on October 14th, Britain suffered a shock that shattered its sense of invulnerability inherited from the First World War. The Royal Navy's main base at Scapa Flow, thought to be impenetrable, heavily fortified with anti-aircraft guns and radar, was infiltrated by the German submarine U-47. It slipped right into the harbor, fired its torpedoes, and sank the battleship Royal Oak, killing 800 sailors. The attack was so audacious that at first the British believed they were under an air raid. Searchlights and anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, while the submarine quietly escaped. The British press, unwilling to believe the truth, reported that German aircraft have damaged an old, obsolete dreadnought from the Great War. In reality, Britain had just lost one of the crown jewels of its navy, and the illusion of safety vanished with it. In mid-October, Soviet embassies in the Baltic states received a secret cable from Molotov. It read, "Comrades, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, there are communist and leftist organizations holding demonstrations, expressing sympathy toward the Soviet Union, and in some cases, even calling for unification with it. All contact with these groups must cease immediately. Such actions could be interpreted as interference by the USSR in the internal affairs of the Baltic states. No more receptions of delegations, no meetings with workers, no official or unofficial communication. If any of these groups approach you, hand the information over to the local police. Our goal is to establish military bases, not to meddle in their domestic politics." This instruction seriously undermines the narrative that Stalin had planned to annex the Baltics from the very beginning. The annexation would indeed come later, but at this early stage, Moscow was, at least formally, careful not to give grounds for accusations of interference. Molotov repeated these directives several times, including throughout 1940, effectively banning any contact with local, friendly movements. Meanwhile, in Germany, the first major clash erupted between the SS and the Wehrmacht. After the Polish campaign, German army generals sent Hitler a letter demanding that SS officers be prosecuted for torture, violence, and looting. "We are a professional army," they wrote, "and the SS are nothing but a gang of thugs." Hitler sided decisively with the SS. On October 17th, he issued a chilling order. SS personnel were no longer subject to military tribunals. Their actions would be judged only by their own internal court. The decree sent shockwaves through the army. Generals saw it as a direct threat to discipline and to the professional ethos of the military corps, but Hitler didn't waver. By then, he already saw the SS as his personal guard, the backbone of his regime. The full consequences of that decision would only become clear after the war. But even in 1939, many inside Germany understood how dangerous it was. The next day, October 18th, Hitler held a meeting where his long-term plans for Poland were finalized. This is documented in the diary of General Franz Halder, who wrote, "Discussed the Polish question. No plans to restore Poland. It will serve as a base for future operations. Administration will not follow German standards. The intelligentsia must be denied access to power. The standard of living is to remain low. Cheap labor. All undesirables to be removed from German territory." In essence, Poland was to become a colony, a reservoir of raw materials, agricultural goods, and slave labor for the Reich. These policies would later be cited at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of Germany's systematic exploitation of occupied territories. October 18th is also the date tied to a persistent historical myth: the supposed secret meeting between Stalin and Hitler in Lwów. According to the legend, two armored trains met. Both leaders stepped out. The city sealed off by joint German-Soviet forces. But in reality, by that time, German troops had already withdrawn from Lwów. The myth seems to have originated from an FBI memo. J. Edgar Hoover sent a note to the White House claiming reliable information that such a meeting had taken place, though he provided no details or reason. It makes little sense. The USSR and Germany already had formal channels, and all official agreements were being signed in Moscow. The claim is easily debunked. Stalin's meticulously kept diary shows that on October 18th he was in Moscow, meeting with Molotov and Zhdanov, while Hitler was holding his conference on the Polish question. Logistically and geographically, a meeting in Lwów was simply impossible. On October 19th, German forces began mobilizing under Fall Gelb. The plan was approved and Hitler announced the invasion of France should start in November. At the same time, London, Paris, and Ankara signed a pact, and British planners even discussed the possibility of airstrikes against Baku, the idea being to cut off German access to Soviet oil and grain shipped by rail through the USSR, using airfields in Iran and Turkey. Word of those plans soon reached Moscow. On October 19th, Molotov again sent a curt cable to Soviet embassies in the Baltics, essentially repeating previous instructions. No fraternizing with local communist groups, no receptions, no meetings, hand any contacts to the police. The message was now routine. In the US, the first meeting of the Uranium Committee took place that same day, the starting point of America's atomic project. Back in Germany, Fall Gelb provoked a storm in the General Staff. Keitel tore into the plan. Halder inspected units and warned the army wasn't ready. Communications would collapse, supply lines would snap, columns would be exposed on the march. "We're not ready," the generals warned. Hitler replied, "You said the same before Poland. We took Poland in 2 weeks. We attack France in November." But weather intervened. Rain and fog grounded air support, and the operation was postponed again and again, ultimately until May 1940. The delays fed conspiratorial talk in the high command. Officers began plotting removals of Hitler, the seeds of what would later be called Operation Valkyrie. On the seas, the heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee began a destructive commerce raiding career, sinking Allied merchant shipping, the first victim being a shell tanker, and would torment the Atlantic through autumn and early winter. In Japan, strict state controls tightened, fixed rice procurement prices, forced purchases from peasants, all to feed the army. By early November, tensions between the High Command and Hitler only deepened. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch tried in vain to reason with him. On November 6th, Hitler summoned Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and demanded another staged provocation, this time through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, to justify an attack through their territory. Canaris hesitated. November 8th, an assassination attempt in Munich. Georg Elser planted a bomb in the Berger Braukeller. Hitler narrowly missed death when his schedule changed. Elser was caught and would remain a prisoner until his execution in April 1945. On November 11th, Polish Independence Day, underground leaflets urged Poles to fly their flags. Governor-General Hans Frank answered with a brutal edict. Any display of the Polish flag would bring summary execution of an entire household. An order applied across occupied towns, especially Warsaw. On November 17th, the Germans laid massive minefields off the Scottish coast, dealing a severe blow to Britain's merchant marine. The Times reported weekly losses measured in tens of thousands of tons, while Admiral Graf Spee and other raiders continued to sink ships, inflaming public anger. Where is the fleet? Why can't we deal with one cruiser? Back in Poland, General Blaskowitz sent Hitler a blistering letter, complaining about SS atrocities, murder, and looting. Hitler's marginal note dismissed it. The Wehrmacht is not a rescue army. Do your job. On November 21st, Molotov publicly mocked the Finnish government in the press, calling them clowns and accusing them of refusing a single sensible Soviet offer. Meanwhile, Admiral Graf Spee kept up its terror in the Atlantic. In 2 weeks, it sank merchant tonnage totaling some 50,000 to 60,000 tons, and the British papers covered it week after week. At the same time, reports came in about German magnetic mines, weapons that seemed unstoppable and were wreaking terrible damage. Until British crews recovered 2 examples, dismantled them, and finally understood how they worked. Once the countermeasure was found, ships were fitted with electrical coils that produced a weak field to neutralize the mine's magnetic triggers. The Navy was protected. On November 25th, France completely sealed Germany's military and trade ports. By sea, Germany now received nothing. But for Hitler, that wasn't catastrophic. Oil, grain, and other essentials still came by rail from the Soviet Union. And iron ore still arrived from Sweden. November 26th was busy. Germany opened contact with the Irish Republican Army, sent agents, and even planned submarine landings of saboteurs near Dublin and Belfast to disrupt British ports. The plot failed, but the attempt was real. And on the same day, the so-called Manila incident occurred. Soviet authorities claimed Finnish artillery had shelled Soviet territory, while the Finns protested that there were no guns there, and that their guns were all on the Mannerheim line. Moscow accused Finland and refused a joint commission to investigate. On November 29th, the USSR broke off diplomatic relations with Finland. And on November 30th, Soviet troops crossed the border. The Winter War had begun. For the Finland campaign, the Soviets threw 425,000 soldiers and officers, some 2,200 tanks and 2,400 aircraft, roughly a threefold advantage. But the Finns were expert winter fighters, well dug in on the Mannerheim line, trained for the climate, and with tactics suited to the terrain. The war began well for the USSR. They quickly seized Petsamo and set up a puppet Terry jockey government, led by communist Otto Kuusinen, while Moscow proclaimed that the Helsinki government had fled, and that this was the legitimate people's government for peace talks. Europe reacted sharply. The United States imposed a moral embargo on exports to the USSR. Britain and France declared support for Finland. Sweden organized a volunteer corps. Denmark sent about 600 men, Norway roughly 1,000, and Britain and France supplied aircraft and materiel. South Africa even provided air units. The US extended a $10 million loan to Finland. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations. Largely symbolic by then, since both the US and Germany were already absent. In America, Roosevelt urged Congress to raise the military budget to $1.3 billion, a huge sum that sparked heated debate, since the US still claimed it would stay out of the war. The first weeks of the Winter War went badly for the Soviets, and by mid-December, the tide turned. The Finns switched to a partisan tactic called motti, from the Finnish word for a cord of wood. A simple, brilliant method where a Soviet column is stopped by blowing up the lead and tail vehicles, so the convoy gets stranded on a narrow forest road in deep freeze, unable to turn around. Snipers and small detachments then pick off the trapped units. Some say the snipers really sat in trees. Others call that a myth, but there's no doubt the Finns operated with precision and brutality. They didn't want to burn equipment. They wanted soldiers to freeze so the vehicles could be salvaged and reused. Soviet columns stretched out, communications broke down, artillery couldn't keep up, and disaster followed. On December 12th, the encirclement and destruction at Tolvajärvi. December 14th, the 168th Division trapped near Lake Ladoga. Later, the 18th Rifle Division and the 34th Tank Brigade were caught in pockets. And by January 8th, the 44th Division was annihilated on the Raate Road. Finnish ski troops seemed to appear from the snow, cut Soviet units to pieces and annihilated them one by one. A shocking lesson for the Red Army, which had not expected this style of warfare. It was then that the world learned of the so-called Molotov cocktail. After Soviet planes bombed Finnish towns, Moscow claimed they were dropping food parcels to help the hungry, and the Finns sarcastically dubbed the incendiary bottles Molotov cocktails. On December 13, 1939, the British Admiralty achieved its first major naval success of the war. Off the coast of Uruguay, near the mouth of the River Plate, 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles, engaged the Admiral Graf Spee, the pride of Germany's commerce raiders. One British ship, Exeter, was badly damaged, but the other 2 pressed the attack and inflicted serious blows. The Graf Spee was forced to retreat to Montevideo for repairs. Uruguayan authorities allowed the crew only 72 hours in port under international law, after which the ship had to leave or be interned. But the British positioned ships outside the harbor, making escape impossible. With no hope of breaking through, the Germans scuttled their vessel on December 17th. Captain Hans Langsdorff and his crew evacuated to Buenos Aires. The story carries an uncanny echo of the past. The Graf Spee had been named after Admiral Maximilian von Spee, who, during the First World War, commanded a German cruiser squadron in the same South Atlantic waters. His fleet was destroyed by the British near the Falkland Islands in 1914, and he died there, along with his 2 sons. 25 years later, a ship bearing his name met the same fate, in the same ocean, at the hands of the same enemy. On December 20th, Captain Langsdorff, following the old Prussian code of honor, a captain shares the fate of his ship, wrapped himself in the ship's battle ensign, and shot himself in his hotel room. He left letters expressing his sense of duty, not allegiance to Hitler, which only deepened the tragedy. Meanwhile, Germany's U-boat campaign continued unabated, and Britain was taking heavy losses. By mid-December, Hitler had already begun planning Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. The reason was simple. German industry relied on Swedish iron ore, much of which traveled through the Norwegian port of Narvik. If the British seized those ports, German steel production would collapse. And what were the British and French doing at that time? They were studying plans for air raids on Batumi, Poti, and Baku, the oil heart of the Soviet Union, to cut Germany off from its Soviet fuel supplies. At the same time, British intelligence was contacting Turkish operatives and white émigré circles, exploring the idea of anti-Soviet uprisings along the USSR's southern frontier. In China, fierce fighting raged in the South Guangxi campaign. Chinese forces attacked with desperate determination, briefly regaining ground near Kunlun Pass. But by late December, the offensive stalled. Losses were catastrophic, and the Japanese front stabilized once more. Thus ended 1939, the first year of the Second World War. In Rome, Pope Pius XII called on the world's leaders to negotiate peace. But no one listened. Behind the scenes, French intelligence was gathering data on Soviet oil infrastructure in the Caucasus, preparing contingency plans for a strike on Baku. In Asia, Japan had expanded its army in China to 1.1 million men. The British press sounded the alarm. In 1 week alone, Hitler's submarines had sunk 114 ships, a staggering figure that some papers exaggerated, but that captured the growing panic. The headlines warned that nearly a quarter of all cargoes from the New World were being lost at sea. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was mired in Finland. The Red Army, unprepared for winter warfare, faced an enemy perfectly adapted to it. Finnish troops used the terrain, the snow, and moti tactics, splitting Soviet columns, isolating divisions, cutting supply lines, and letting frost and snipers finish the rest. Soviet command was stunned. By the end of December, the German General Staff presented Hitler with a report. "We have studied the first months of the Soviet-Finnish War. The Red Army is massive but inefficient. Its combat capability is extremely low." It was then that Hitler made his infamous remark, "The Soviet army is a colossus with feet of clay. The country has millions of men, but no one who can fight." That was 1939, the first year of the Second World War. Poland lay in ruins. France and Britain sat behind their lines in the Phony War. Germany ruled the seas with ruthless confidence. Japan was bogged down in China. And the Soviet Union was bleeding in Finland. And as history would prove, it was only the beginning. Thank you for watching our history lessons. We've just begun this major series on the Second World War, and it will continue throughout the year. See you in the next episode.